Okay, welcome to episode 5, Get Outdoor with Dawn and Dora. Dora's at work right now, so it's just me. And so I've got my camera on a tripod, and so today's subject is going to be a review of the Smittybilt CO2 tank, the Power Tank CO2 tank. Which one I like more? Was it worth the money to spend the extra money on the Power Tank or the Smittybilt? And then there's the Viair P400 air compressor, which I use basically as a backup. So anyways, let me get here. Give you a better look at it. There it is. Very nice air compressor. So I guess I will start with the Smittybilt tank first. Sorry, Power Tank, I put one of your decals on my Smittybilt tank only because the Smittybilt decal was coming off of there. So I figured I might as well make a match. This one I've had for probably 6 years. This one I've had only for maybe a year and a half. And this one I've also had for probably 5 to 6 years. Anyway, so moving from right to left, the Smittybilt tank has been actually pretty good. I've had some problems with it over the last couple years. It worked great up until about like 3 or 4 years ago, and I had no issues with it. It's got all the little problems that most Smittybilt tanks have. You've got a lot of frost and freeze issues. I usually get it to work out here in Arizona. I don't know if it's warm enough or that it doesn't stop working altogether and freezes up entirely, but it really works pretty well for the most part. Like I said, I filled this thing up several times. I've probably filled this thing up 5, 6 times since I've owned it. Works every time. Slows down a little bit when it starts to freeze up. Doesn't quite want to work right. I'll have to stop for a second and refill after a couple seconds of waiting. Then it'll actually kick back on again and start working. The one big issue that I had with this tank was a few years back here now. This valve is not the valve that belongs on this tank. This valve I had bought off of Amazon because the original valve stopped working. I went through a whole bunch of research and trying to figure out what was wrong with this tank. One day I get out of work and I get in my Jeep, and I noticed there wasn't much air in the inside of the vehicle, and so I got out right away, and I figured something happened with this. The diaphragm blew out in the back of this valve, which actually happened. But I got the diaphragm replaced, put it back in, tried to recharge the tank, and it would not hold a charge. After a couple days, I would go out and check my vehicle, and there would be no CO2 in this tank. So what I did was I took it to a fire extinguisher shop. They took off the valve. They replaced an O-ring in there, and they put it back on, figuring that was the problem. Tightened everything back up again. Not the problem. A couple days later, it's empty again. Also thought maybe the diaphragm blew again. Replaced that again. That wasn't the problem. So what I did was I looked really close at the tank after I'd bought this power tank, and I noticed this embossed symbol on here. It says "Made in USA." And I can't remember for the life of me again the name of this valve, the maker that makes this valve. But it's a quality valve. It's a better valve than what I had on this tank. So what I did was I got on Amazon and I bought a very similar valve. It's probably not exactly the same. I think this one actually has higher flow than this one. By the way, this one actually still works very, very well, but I got the same brand. It's like a little wavy deal on there. I wish I could remember. I probably should have wrote it down before I started doing this video, but now this tank works fantastic. No leaks, no issues whatsoever. So if you have a Smittybilt tank and you can't hold any CO2 in it, look at replacing this valve. This valve that Smittybilt puts on there, there's no insignia on it. It's made in China, very cheap. There's no markings on it really, other than it says made in China and maybe like a part number. But since I've replaced this valve, it's worked fantastic. These gauges still work really well. Don't really have any issues with that. Don't have any issues with any leakage around here or here. I've got multiple hoses, so I don't really have to depend on the Smittybilt hose that came with this tank. This tank was probably about $300. This tank was around $600. Was it worth it? I don't know. I could still probably get by with this tank. If I had two of these tanks and maybe this valve went bad, for, I don't know, maybe 20 bucks, I could probably buy another valve and put it on this tank. It's all up to you. So far, with this power tank, I've had no issues whatsoever. Overall, I like the construction. The handles, you can see, are very similar. They feel pretty close to the same. Power tank likes to tote their qualities, you know, head and shoulders above. In the handle, I don't see it as much. It's about the same handle. Now, the gauges and the valve is probably where you're going to see the difference. Even the tank, I don't know if it's necessarily a better tank or not. I've had no issues with this tank. It holds pressure. Like I said, other than this valve on top, I've had no other issues with this Smittybilt tank. This doesn't quite, the barrel regulator here doesn't quite work as well. So really, all your money's going to this regulator, to the valve. Maybe the tank is maybe a better build tank, but as far as being able to look at it, I really don't know for sure. Anyways, if I were to be stuck somewhere and I needed one or the other, I'd want the power tank. The power tank, I would say, would be the most reliable. It's going to have the least number of issues. Just a fantastic product, really. Then again, I've only owned it for like a little over a year or so. This tank I've owned for probably 4 or 5 years, maybe 6. The air compressor, I've owned that for just about the same amount of time that I've owned the Smittybilt tank. This is, by the way, is another fantastic product. I actually use one of the CO2 tanks as my primary tire inflator. You're just going to do it a lot faster. I'm not going to touch on how fast CO2 is over an air compressor. There's plenty of videos on YouTube about that. But CO2, I've aired up my tires on my Jeep here. They're 35-inch tires by 12.5. And I am done with all 4 tires when somebody with an air compressor like this is still on their first or second tire. You're just going to get off the trail quicker. You're going to inflate your tires from 15 psi to 35 psi probably in about 20 seconds or so, depending on how often you stop the flow to check the tire pressure. But overall, my go-to numero uno is my CO2 tanks. Right now I'm feeding off of this one. This one's still pretty full yet. This one I had filled not too long ago. It's just sitting in the garage waiting to be used. So when this one empties or gets close to empty, I'll switch to this one. But if I think this one's getting low, I'll keep the CO2 or the air compressor with me, and I'll use that as my backup. And then when I get home, I'll take this tank out and I'll put this one in. So anyways, both fantastic products. Like I said, half the price, the Smittybilt tank. You got to decide for yourself whether it's worth the price or not. But I think if you're thinking it's a piece of junk and you can't do anything with it after maybe you have an issue like I did and it doesn't hold air, look at replacing this valve with a new one. You can find CO2 tank valves on Amazon. You can find them at beverage shops. We played heck trying to figure out. I probably had this thing filled twice before we could figure out what was wrong with it. And I eventually just replaced this valve, and it's been holding CO2 ever since. This one, like I said, no problems yet. It's not as new, but I feel that Power Tank has probably done the extra homework on their product. It is overall a nicer product, I have to say. The fit and finish is a little bit better. The valve works better. This barrel adjustment where you set it to tire or air tool or whatever, it works fantastic. And then again, if you're just going to use an air compressor, plan on waiting a little while when you're getting off the trail or you're inflating anything in particular. It's not going to inflate as fast. Liquid CO2 is the bomb. It's badass. I've never used anything that inflates this fast. They say that liquid CO2 is 5 times the volume when it comes out from when it transfers from liquid to gas. So it just pumps up a tire really quick, and in my opinion, I can't really beat it. I hooked it up an air tool to this tank. I had to change a lockout on a toolbox that I bought and didn't have the key for, so I had to change, and the lock was a funny size. So I have an air grinder, and I use this, and boy, it's got plenty of pressure on there to run an air grinder. All kinds of air tools. You could probably run impact wrenches off of either one of these. You just have such high flow that's just unreal. This, like I said, is my backup, and it's also been very good. Not disappointed in it whatsoever. I just keep it around, but eventually compressors burn out. Guys that run ARB lockers, they'll get the expensive ARB compressors, and eventually they'll burn up. So if I have to replace this, I have to replace it, but I don't really use it that much. So I imagine it's going to last me a really, really, really long time. If I used it like every day, all the time, yeah, probably be replacing it a lot sooner. But so far, quality product, very happy with it. It's the Viair P400. Came with this bag. It's got a little set of hoses in here. I actually use this hose with this gauge, this ARB gauge, when I fill up with CO2 or the air compressor. Either one, they work equally as well. But there's so much pressure sometimes coming out of the CO2 tank, it makes it hard to push this lever down to actually get air to come out. It's just, you got to give it a little bit more of a push because it's forcing so much air through this gauge when you put it on the tire. But that's just a testament of how much pressure you get out of these CO2 tanks and how quickly they'll fill your tires. So anyways, if you like what you saw, you like my review, click below, subscribe, or click and like.